And we're back.
Hooray.
All right, talking about dry sump engine. The yeah. Okay. Okay, so it goes. It's always going to go from the oil sump through the suction, from the suction screen to the pump, from the pump out, and then from there it goes through the next screen. Like we'll talk about your engine because it's easier. It goes to the pressure screen, if you will, this one right here. Then from here it's going to go to the oil pressure relief, and then out to the engine. Now the dry sump is a little more complicated. So the purpose of a dry sump engine really comes into play where, Juan, you have a wet or dry sump?
Wet.
You have wet? Okay. Our Bonanza has a dry sump. And the reason why is because the landing gear comes up and there's not enough room underneath the engine to put an oil sump. So there's a very shallow one, very shallow, it holds a couple of quarts. And from there it's got to go to another tank where most of the oil is held up on the firewall because there's not enough room for, like I said, the sump and a nose wheel to come up in there. Let me think. Radial engines all have dry sumps. Why? Because where exactly would you put it? The bottom of the engine has what on it? Cylinders. So there is a sump. It's very narrow, and it's between the bottom ones. Very narrow and about yay big, and holds about that big around. It only holds a couple of quarts. And from there it goes to the tank on the firewall. So those are all dry sump engines. Let's see here. Dry sump. Dry sump. Yeah, most all radials. Why most all radial engines? Because I don't know any that aren't this way. So inverted engines. Some opposed. Engines. Like I said, the V-tail Bonanza is one of them. And that is due to clearance issues. With the sump and nose gear. That's with the V-tail. Obviously, radial engines, well, I explained why, because the cylinders are on the bottom. Inverted engines, because cylinders are on the bottom.
Is the sump always, or the tank always forward, like up where the engine is?
Yes, you want it as close as possible. The further away you put it, the longer the hoses have to be. And the longer the hoses are, the more chances for hose failure. All right, I forgot. Yes?
It's basically like, the other day I walked by the little, should have got the name?
The Rotax?
Rotax,
Uh-huh.
it has a little tank sitting right next to the engine.
That one also has, that's liquid cooled, so
Okay.
yeah, I think that one's got same thing, if I remember correctly. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the operation of the dry sump. Because it is more complex. So the first thing we have is an oil tank. And the oil tank is mounted on the firewall, basically. Firewall or kind of mounted around the engine mounts. So we'll just say oil tank is mounted on the firewall. Now, let's say one for each engine. One for each engine. Because you wouldn't want to have just one oil tank to feed multiple engines, because what if there was a catastrophic failure on one engine and it made a bunch of metal? You wouldn't want to contaminate a central oil tank. You want to keep the contamination. Or if you had a catastrophic failure of an engine and it it lost all of its oil. Well, you wouldn't want the remaining engines to be starving for oil. The outlet is at or near the lowest point. Is at or near the lowest point. Oh, good. I do mention. I was going to say that's not always the case. And as I look at my notes, I made note of that. Second outlet below, that's important. Below the normal outlet may be provided. And the reason why you'd want a second one below, so if you will, kind of figure that you have an oil tank, and this may be the outlet to the engine. Erase that. But we're going to make another second outlet right there. And that way, if something bad were to happen and the oil level got down to here, what's going to happen to the engine oil? Going to the engine.
You're going to lose the oil.
Gets hot.
It's going to get hot. Yes. So we can have any oil going to the engine.
No, and you're going to have some pretty blue metal.
Okay, you're going to have some pretty blue metal. We're about to have a catastrophic failure. So one of the things that you want if you have a twin engine aircraft or a multi-engine aircraft, right before your catastrophic failure, you're going to want to shut that engine down and you're going to want to feather the prop. And what that means is with the constant speed propeller, where the blades change, you want to feather it. So all of the blades are going to go streamline into the wind so that as the air flows over the propeller, it's not windmilling the propeller and dragging this engine that just turned blue and maybe locked up. So if the engine locked up and the propeller's still trying to windmill, it's really going to pull that side of the airplane way back. It's all this extra drag. So you want your propeller to be feathered. Well, in order to feather it, oftentimes you need oil. And if you just lost all of your oil, you can't feather. So that's why you always leave a little bit of reserve, if you need it, for the prop. And you can have a feathering pump or something along that line, but it's enough oil so that you can feather out the prop. So second below normal outlet may be provided to feather prop. Of course, after a loss of all other oil. Some aircraft, and I'm going to say radials with large supply tanks, use that's an A hopper tank. Hopper tank. Or also called a temperature accelerating well. And the purpose of that is because radial engines use such large quantities of oil, like the smallest radial pretty much in normal production. I'm looking at the Stearman. Stearman used the Continental W670, which is a 7-cylinder radial, 670 cubic inches. That's pretty small. It uses 6 gallons of oil. That's just normal. And so think about the warm-up period of 6 gallons of oil. So you have all this cold oil, and the engine starts to warm up, and it's kind of like the engine's going, are we done yet? I mean, just finished warming up some oil, and you keep feeding me cold oil. So you're going to be feeding it cold.
Quarters to gallons.
What's that?
How much quarters make a gallon?
4. So it's 24 quarts.
Oh, so big.
24 quarts. So what you can do is have a temperature accelerating well. So I don't know kind of the way So here we have our big oil tank here. And there's our filler. And so what you can do is actually take and put like a smaller section in here, and we'll drill a bunch of holes in it so the oil can easily flow. But oil coming from the engine will dump into here, and oil being sucked out of the engine will go this way. So as the engine starts up and runs, it's going to suck it out of this hopper, which figured a cylindrical thing with holes drilled all the way around it. So here comes the warm oil. Can I do this?
Yes, so it mixes up.
So warm oil is going to come in here and start filling this up, and it's going to easily roll down this way. But at the same time, it's going to radiate out from here and start warming up this oil. And as this oil radiates and gets warmed up, it's going to flow into these little holes and start mixing in with the other one. So as time goes by, all of the oil is going to get warmed up, and then the whole big tank is being used. All 6 gallons in this case are being used, but we started off with just this little bit where it came through back into here. So you can see how that would work. So it works as a small supply, then it works as a big supply.
So the holes in that cylinder are small enough to where if it's high viscosity, it's not being able to penetrate through the holes and
Pretty much.
actually heat it
Yep.
until it solidifies?
There you go. All right, so that's our temperature accelerating rail, or hopper. I don't know. The W670 uses 6 gallons. That's 24 quarts. And that's, again, that's the small radial. It just goes up from there. The hopper is a well within a tank that allows a smaller amount of oil to be used during engine warm-up. And then we could say, see the warm oil then warms up the tank oil. There we go. And then warm oil from the tank flows into the hopper. All right, you guys are still writing a little bit. What, I write faster than you? You just write you just write nicer than I do. Takes more time. You have a Q&A question that talks about the required items, the required placards on an oil tank. And required items comes from FAR 23.1013. Let's see. Who's got, nobody has their FAR book on them. What is FAR 23? Certification of standards, normal utility and aerobatic category?
Yes.
Okay, so certification standards. Your Q&A question is one of those tricky questions where I believe that there's it gives you references. And I believe that some of the other answers are better, but it's the wrong reference. So what are the actual required items under 23.13? And there are several. So 1, it must have an expansion space.
This is for both dry and sump.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I never thought about it, but I believe it does. All right, so it has an expansion space. Let me see. 10% or 1/2 gallon. Whichever is more. So you gotta have that much space. And that's so that when your oil heats up, it expands, you get foaming in there, anything else, it's not getting blown overboard. So I was just trying to think here. We're talking about our, we talk about the engine we have in class right now. We'll say that's a six quart capacity. So what would we need to have on there?
0.6 quarts
Well,
extra.
6 quarts would be 1.5 gallons.
Yeah.
So 10% would be 0.12 of a gallon. So, okay, so which we default to half a gallon. So it's going to be half a gallon of space in there. So 2 quart space. We talk about the W670 that had 6 gallons or 24 quarts. So 10% would be 2.4 quarts, right? I'm doing my math in my head, right? So which is more, 2.4 quarts or half gallon?
2.4.
The 2.4. It's bigger by 0.4, so you'd have to have that. So you have to have that expansion space, and that is one of your Q&A questions, correct? I haven't got there yet.
I think it says 5-gallon tank.
The 5-gallon. Okay, so the Q&A is specific to 5-gallon. So a 5-gallon tank, which would be how many quarts?
0.5, so it's exactly half.
No, how many quarts is 5 gallons?
Oh,
20 gallons.
10% of that.
No,
20 quarts. Sorry,
yeah.
5 gallons is 20 quarts.
Yeah, so it's 2.
So 20 quarts would be 2 quarts. 2 quarts is
Half a gallon.
half a gallon. What is the answer on that Q&A?
Half a gallon or 10%.
Half a gallon or 10%.
Comes out as half a gallon.
Oh, they don't make you do it. They just, okay. So maybe that's why they ask. Giving you a break on that. All right, so you got to have some expansion space. You got to have a vent on your tank. So each oil tank must be vented. Specifically, it says each oil tank must be vented to the engine from the top part of the expansion space so that the vent connection is not covered by oil under any normal flight conditions. Normal flight conditions. Well, what about if you go inverted? Because I was inverted. Well, is it okay just to go fly? I mean, I got a little 150. Can I go out and go inverted if I feel like it?
Yeah, you can. Some kind of Seattle did it.
You probably can, that plane probably can.
I don't think so that yours is aerobatic.
Okay, so
You just gotta
my
fill the
plane,
oil gallery.
well, they did make a Cessna 150 Aerobat.
Uh-huh.
And what was interesting about that plane is it was not fuel injected, it was carbureted. So what happens to a carburetor when you go inverted? Engine stops. All right, if it does not have an inverted oil system, which this one didn't, because I think it's still the Continental 200, where does the oil go? To the top of the engine. No, the carburetor's on the bottom. So the carburetor's down here and you go this way. So the carburetor doesn't work, oil goes that way. So what's the oil pump stop doing? Stops pumping oil, but the engine keeps going because of the propeller. So that's not a great idea. If you keep positive, like a barrel roll with positive G's, you can keep doing it. But anybody know what the FARs say about unusual attitudes? What you have to do?
You have to have double.
Yeah, okay, yep. What do you got to have?
Parachute.
Parachute if you go past what?
60 degrees.
60 degrees bank or 30 degrees nose up, nose down, right? Yeah. So it's not like you're just out there doing aerobatic all the time anyway, unless you want to bust an FAR because you don't have a parachute on. Otherwise, everybody has to have parachutes on. All right, so let's see. Must be vented. Must be. What's that?
Are there any exceptions to the
Not that I know of.
Don't walk away.
Well, a lot of planes that are aerobatic, they have parachute cushions. So they're already packed in right there. You just got to put it on the way out. Placard it. If leaving the aircraft before the end of the flight, please make sure to don your parachute. Okay.
Properly place your seat back trays in the upright and locked position.
All right.
And oh, by the way, grab your seat because that'll help you fly when you fall down.
I should never have told him I had a microphone. Oil tank vents must be arranged so that condensation, I'll say condensed water vapor, that might freeze, does not block the opening. There we go. Can I change my screen here?
No.
No. Survey says.
No.
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe.
I'll just go really slow. All right, so the vent has to be arranged so that it won't freeze. Which, how do you do that? Well, don't put the vent outside. If you put the vent somewhere near the engine, guess what? The engine's creating enough heat that it doesn't get that cold inside of the engine. So behind the baffling is usually pretty warm back there. So, all right, changing, going up, I said, up and over. So unprofessional. All right, and C, since we're talking about it, for aerobatic planes, A-E-R-O-B-A-T. For aerobatic category, yes, you in the front.
For your
Speak into the
FAR,
microphone. For what?
For your FAR reference number, did you say it was FAR 231013?
I believe I did.
It's actually FAR 251013.
What is FAR 25?
Oil tanks.
It's 25. Let's see.
25 itself.
Should be 23.
I don't think that's right.
Transport category airplane.
What is FAR 25?
It's airworthiness standards for transport category airplanes.
Yes, we're definitely not talking about FAR 25. We are talking 23.
But in
That's the point.
23, it doesn't list the oil.
I'll have to look at that. For aerobatic, are you in the AIM?
First FAR 23.
You're in FAR AIM?
7.
There's your problem. Airman Information Manual?
AMT.
AMT. All right, well, I'll look at that. All right, for aerobatic category airplanes, let's see. There must be a means. Must be a means to prevent hazardous loss of oil during aerobatic maneuvers, including short periods of inverted flight. So there must be a means to prevent oil loss. And I'll show you a little bit. We'll talk near the end about the Christian inverted oil system and how it works. It's a very simple little thing. And basically what happens is it's set up so that the engine can actually suck oil from either the bottom through the sump, or when the airplane goes inverted, because an inverted airplane like a Christian Eagle or something like that has a fuel injection system. Fuel injection system has absolutely no idea what is up and what is down, does not care. And it's all enclosed. So it goes upside down, and as long as it's getting fuel from the tanks, which you can put a floppy tube in there with a weight on it, and it'll pick up wherever the fuel is. So what's going to happen then is the oil will all slosh up to what we think of as the top of the engine, but it's now the bottom, and you just put the breather, it becomes the suction tube. And the suction tube becomes the breather. And you just have a little ball valve that goes back and forth. So we'll look at that. All right, so what else we have? We have the vent. All right. So we have expansion space, got to have a vent, and we must have a cap. with the words oil or 710. Some caps say 710. Which is simply oil upside down. So if it says 710, rotate it, look it around the other way. Okay, so oil, grade, or reference. Or reference. And that is under 23.1557. My notes should have capacity. But not required. And I put should have capacity because it's funny, most aircraft do have the capacity on it. And I think it's just a really nice thing to note. And last thing, we need an outlet. Because there was a committee and somebody thought, you know what, we should make it a law that there's actually an outlet. So no screens. That can restrict flow of.
Also to ask you, if the filter gets blocked, it's a requirement that oil should flow to the engine somehow?
Yes. So if we're talking screens, that's something different. We're talking about an oil tank in a dry system, no screens. Not trying to filter oil. There should be nothing that can hinder the flow of oil to the oil pump. So no screens that restrict flow of oil to engine.
Can you have a screen after the pump?
Then it goes to pump. Then we know we have a screen or a filter at that point. So no screens that can restrict flow of the engine. And outlet diameter. May not be smaller than oil pump inlet. All right, so those are the things we need. And what was the Q&A question? I believe, because you have to have the cap, the oil cap must have how many things?
It has to say oil.
Grade.
So basically two things. It must say oil, and it also must say
Grade.
the grade or a reference to it. Your Q&A question doesn't say that.
Yeah,
It simply says oil.
well,
I think another one does say oil or grade or quantity or something, but it's a completely wrong reference. So that's why that question, every time I get that question, I'm like, oh, that's wrong. Oh, reference. It's the reference on it is you got to look for the right reference. All right, so those are the things we got to have on there. And you would be surprised when, as an IA, when I'm doing an annual inspection, these are the kind of things that you can get busted for. So I license an aircraft, we call it licensing, or sign off the annual inspection, and it goes out and has some sort of problem with the landing gear, and the FAA comes along and goes, that cap doesn't say anything on it. It's on me. That's the kind of things you have to check for. All right. B. Let's see. What was A? A was all about the oil tank. Now we're talking about B, the oil temp gauge. Except that this, probably shouldn't put it as B because this is under dry sump. And this applies to both sumps, so we'll put that both. Both sump systems, unless otherwise noted. All right, so we have the oil temp gauge. Oil temp is taken, oops, as oil enters the engine. I was trying to think of a way that I could be more specific on this. And so more specific would be after the pump, before the oil cooler. And it could be possible that an aircraft out there reconfigures it, does something different, but in generality, that's the way it goes. You don't want to take it right, they don't want it right after the oil cooler. Because if the oil cooler did a really, really good job, you would have no idea what's happening with the engine. So let's say the engine it's got a problem and the crankshaft is turning blue and the oil is going through there and it's getting to 300, 400 degrees Fahrenheit, not Celsius, and comes through, goes to the oil cooler, and the oil cooler's doing its job, and it gets it back down to 180, 200, and you're looking as a pilot going, everything's cool, I'm okay. And what's happening in the engine is not okay. And so that's why you want to know really what's happening after it's gone through. At the same time, they don't, for whatever reason, don't want to take it right after it leaves the engine, because that could scare you. So, so it's got to be a happy medium. But once you know something's going on, don't want to scare you. So it goes pump, tell you what the pressure or the temperature is. Then we can cool it down. Then we can put it through the engine, go into the sump, pick it up. What's the temp? So now, like on my aircraft, it doesn't have an oil cooler, so it's going to go sump, pick it up with the oil pump, screen. My temp is right at the screen, and so through the screen, going to go through the engine. It's going to get hotter as it goes to the engine, fall down, go into the sump. The sump is on like an O200 is actually a bulb kind of hanging down below it, so there's air flowing over it. So that helps cool it down. So it cools down a little bit. Right, so it got hotter going through the engine, fell down in there, cooled down a little bit, picked it up. I see the temp, so I don't get scared. Then it goes back through the engine where it gets hotter. Right?
Why don't oil sumps have fins on them, like cooling fins?
I don't know. They didn't ask you. You weren't there to advise them. Had you have been, that would probably be what we have, cooling fins on them. That would make sense. All right, so oil temp. Oil temp should be 180 to about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And I know I mentioned before that gauge is often way off. I have troubleshot or had people come to me more often than not. I learned from this. So I would have airplanes come to me where, you know, the oil temp is so hot, Kevin, I've had all these mechanics look at it, nobody can do anything. Of course, they'd always call and say, oh, bring it down, take a look at it. Come in, take a look at it, and I'm looking and go, wow, you know, all the mechanics who have worked on this have really done a good job. You know, I mean, it is so tight, all the baffle is sealed up well. Well, let's just make sure your oil temp gauge works. And, you know, I told you my trick, I'll heat up some oil and do it. I'm like, wow, you know, when it should be 180, you're reading like 240. So your problem isn't that you've really gone the other way. Your oil is almost too cold now all the time. So then I learned from that. Whenever somebody brought me an airplane, the first thing I would do is calibrate their oil temp gauge. And I told you how I made a little card where all the words in oil temp actually meant something. And you'd think I'd do that for myself, but I haven't.
Can you replace oil temperature gauge, or is that considered like an alteration of some sort?
No, you can buy a new one and put it in. But you take like a Cessna that has like a cluster gauge. It has the fuel quantity, oil temp, oil pressure. I don't know. That's probably like $20,000 for that little thing or something. You know.
No biggie.
Yeah. So better to make a card. Or just go in there and bend the needle a little bit. You know. Right. Max temp about 240 degrees. And the engine adds about 50 degrees as it goes through. So
Maybe that's 50 degrees.
what's that?
On top of that?
Yeah. Okay. So most red lines are right about 240. I don't want to run my plane at red line, so I want to keep about at least 180. If it's not at 180, you're not burning off that water because 180 plus 50 is 230. I'm over boiling. So it's going to boil off all that water. Remember I talked to you about running the airplane on the ground and then just shutting it down? If the oil does not all get to at least 180 on the gauge, it's not hitting over 200 as it goes to the engine. All right, and so your gauge is going to tell you, I want my gauge to say 180 to 200. The gauge red line is going to say 240. So if I'm red lined at 240, as it goes to the engine, it's going to go up to 290. I actually said she's going to go up to 290. Why I just personified oil and made it female, I don't know.
Hey Kevin, there's something that talks about the oil separator. Does it have to do with anything?
Oh, I don't know if I made notes, so I'll just tell you real quick. The oil separator. What does an oil separator have to do with? Not a lot of modern planes have oil separators anymore. Oil separators are found on wet vacuum pumps. And a wet vacuum pump actually uses a little bit of engine oil inside of the vacuum pump. The vacuum pump creates a vacuum, and that vacuum drives your instruments. So all of your gyro instruments, not all of them, but most of your instruments for flight have gyroscopes in them, and the gyroscopes have to be spooled up. There's a couple of them that are electrical, but most of them are run off vacuum. So you could blow into them. That's not a problem. But the problem with blowing into the instruments is you pick up stuff, and if the pump ever broke, it would blow all the pieces into an instrument. And, I don't know, a nice attitude indicator probably cost you $5,000, $6,000, $10,000. So that would really ruin your day to have a bunch of gyros go out from. So instead, use a vacuum pump, and the vacuum pump pulls the air, and then you put a filter on the inlet. So as long as that filter's there, nothing bad's going to happen. So older aircraft use wet pumps, which actually worked a lot better because they're well lubricated, but they required an oil separator to get the oil out of it. Most aircraft now use a dry pump, we call it. It's carbon vein pumps. So that's the answer to that. So oil separator equals vacuum pump. I forget the question. Remember the question?
There was a question, yeah.
Yeah, there is one, but I think as long as you know it's a vacuum pump, you're like, okay, it's vacuum pump. Probably doesn't belong in this section, but if I don't put it in there, you'll probably never see it again because it's in such an odd place. Okay. So pressure pump. Our pressure pump. Our pressure pump is what kind of pump is it?
Pressure.
It is. What kind? There we go. Gear-driven constant displacement. And one of the things that you guys got away with this year, I removed it, was having to measure the clearances of the pump. And the reason why I deleted it is because it is so complicated that it was just causing this like screeching halt. It was taking almost 2 days for groups to actually get through that. I think it just became this, I don't know what to do. Let me think. For those of you at home, sorry you can't see this. So the clearances involve, well, first of all, housings nowadays are a single piece housing. They don't have the two pieces. So that did make it complicated for you guys because all the dimensions are based on the fact that a single piece housing. So the dimensions include the clearance between this and the case, this and the accessory case. There's 2, right? Actually 4 complete measurements right there. So dimension of that, dimension of that, dimension of this, dimension of the case. Then it's going to be how this fits in to the gear. There's 2 more if anyone wants to count. I got 6. Then you've got this gear on the shaft. Although the new ones, the shaft is part of the gear, so you'd have to measure this one into the accessory case and this hole into the case. Then you've got to measure how the gears fit in here. So number 1, you've got to measure your side clearance, which is what is the gap between the gear and the side of the case. That's a pretty important one because if that gap gets too big when it goes to pump stuff around, then you're just going to have a lot of loss in there. Then you have side end clearance, end clearance is how much gap the difference between the height of the gear and the height of the oil pump body. So I don't know, how many more is that? What do we got, about 8, 9, 10, 12 measurements right there? Yeah, it gets a little crazy, and so you got to get all of those in there.
You also have to measure backlash on that.
Yeah, I think there was backlash in there too. Yeah. So get all of those measurements. So keep in mind that we're doing a little bit of an abbreviated stuff over there. So all right. So pressure pump. What does a pressure pump do? Pressure pump sucks oil up from the tank. One of the things that you will have to do that can cause some significant frustrations for you is in the next 8 weeks, so you have 4 weeks break for me, then I'll come back in 8 weeks. The first thing we're going to start doing is mounting up engines and running them. And remember, you have 1 week to do it. And when you have an engine that came from the factory, was overhauled, the first thing you need is oil pressure. If you're not a mechanic that really cares much, go ahead, put it together, put the spark plugs in, get in, start it up, and go. Just start it up and look at the oil pressure gauge and hope that you get some pressure within 30 seconds. All right, but if it's your engine and you built it and you really care, you're going to want oil pressure before you ever put any pressure on the engine. So the way I did my engines was the last thing I did before I put the spark plugs in, so no spark plugs at all, especially not the bottom ones. If I forget to tell you this, don't put the bottom ones in because you guys are the only ones that have put oil in your cylinders. How much oil did we use? A lot. He's like, a lot. So yes, so all that oil's in there. And if you put the bottom spark plugs in, they're just going to fill full of oil and not work. So keep the bottom plugs out. And in the field, what I would do is I would use the starter of the aircraft and motor it around. And it motors pretty fast, and there's no pressure on it until you got oil pressure. And I had to tell you, there are times when you're watching your watch thinking, I've got a duty cycle, I said duty, on the starter, and that starter's getting kind of hot. I don't want to burn up a starter. And it starts to worry you a little bit. And you're like, I should have got oil pressure by now. Well, one of the things when I started doing these Lycomings, I was, somebody was not happy because you're going to burn up all the starters getting oil pressure. I'm like, well, never burn up a starter on the A65 getting oil pressure because it didn't have a starter. So I said, well, okay, to solve this, I kind of set up a rule. You guys get about, I think 30 seconds of starter use to start the engine. So, because we have brand new starters. So I'm going to time you. So when you are ready to go, so you get 30 seconds worth of starter use it any way you want. So if you're sitting there cranking it trying to start and you've used 30 seconds, I'll say, you got to stop and troubleshoot. So that means you can't use the starter to get oil pressure. So that means you got to use the Armstrong method. And so you're going to be standing on the front of the propeller moving it around. And you can move it around this fast for, I don't know, about 15, 20 seconds per person. So you got to get it going. So you want to get oil pressure as soon as possible. So some of you I've told a little trick. I think it's time for you to go. I'll just tell you a little trick. And you can use a little bit of black moly grease in there on those gears. It's cheating, but it'll help you. So, all right, don't go away mad. Just go away. Be careful, it's raining.